Hello and welcome. My name is Hallie Franks. I am an associate professor of ancient studies at the Gallatin School at New York University, and it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I would like to thank Matthew Santaracco and Mara Pollard for their support and very hard work in imagining and bringing this series to life. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD candidates, and we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. In this video, we will hear from, and I will speak with, Tuhin Bhattacharjee, a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at New York University. His research brings together ancient Greek and Sanskrit texts, as well as their reception in post-colonial Bengali culture, 20th and 21st century feminist philosophy, and the German-English socialist tradition, in order to investigate figurations of desiring mothers in antiquity. He was recently awarded the NYU Mainzer Summer Fellowship for conducting research in India. He is an educational ambassador for Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and his most recent essays on the intersections between feminist philosophy and cultures of antiquity have been accepted for publication in Philosophia, a journal of transcontinental feminism published with SUNY Press, and the Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics. Today, Tuhin's presentation is I Killed My Mother, Desiring Mothers in Greek and Indian Antiquity. Tuhin.
Thank you so much, Hallie, for having me and for that wonderful introduction. I'm very honored indeed to be here. So I'll start with an anecdote from one of the texts that I'm working with. In Shishir Kumar Das's untranslated Bengali collection called Olaukik Sanglap, which means Unearthly Dialogues, it was published only as recently as 2011. So in this dialogue, the ancient Greek prince Orestes literally runs into the ancient Indian sage Parshuram in the Greek mountains. And in the conversation that follows between them, each uncannily discovers that the other too is guilty of killing his own mother. So they had both killed their mothers on the command of their father because she had desired another man. This speculative dialogue by Das between two ancient characters in modern Bengali, the dialogue takes place in modern Bengali, serves as a methodological grounding for my dissertation that brings together ancient Greek and ancient Sanskrit texts, as well as their receptions in post-colonial Bengal, 19th century socialist thought, and contemporary feminist philosophy in order to investigate figurations of desiring mothers in antiquity. The discipline of gender studies has traditionally relied on Western history and myth, and hence indirectly on ancient Greek legacy to fashion conceptual models to counter the forces of patriarchy and heterosexism. But this has also served to parochialize the field and led to some problematic methodologies that do not sufficiently attend to the complexities of non-Western cultures, where, as in India, for instance, gender cannot be understood in isolation from other social factors such as caste. But what happens when the mothers of ancient India are made to confront the mothers from Greece? How can such dialogues or polylogues address urgent concerns in gender and sexuality studies? My interdisciplinary project uses the tools of philology, ancient Indian semantics, psychoanalysis, post-colonial criticism, and feminist queer theory to interrogate maternal figurations in antiquity, from Hesiod to Plato to Greek tragedy on the one hand, and from the Vedas to the Upanishads to the Hindu epic Mahabharata. I try to demonstrate how a critical comparative reading of ancient texts can really revitalize the study of antiquities as well as of gender and sexuality by problematizing their underlying disciplinary assumptions. For instance, the conflation of the feminine with nature, or the myth of a prehistoric matriarchy, or the use of psychoanalytic complexes as universal prototypes. By returning to the maternal figure in antiquity and tracing its genealogies across unexpected geoliterary terrains, such as 19th century socialism and an early psychoanalyst from Bengal, which I'll talk about soon, my dissertation interrogates these foundational moments in ways that warrant, I think, a radical remapping of our desires, traditions, and philosophical inheritances. Now, despite the thesis of a shared mythological repertoire among the Indo-European family group, there has been little research on how these texts can be brought together to shed light on contemporary debates in gender studies. I suggest that it is only through a rigorous philological study of Indo-Greek literatures that we can trace the enduring power of the maternal spectre in later traditions, such as anthropology and psychoanalysis. So several anthropologists and historians, for instance, have advanced the theory of an archaic goddess religion in prehistoric Eurasia, claiming to have discovered a matrilineal and matrifocal, if not matriarchal, society that was eventually destroyed and overtaken by the patriarchal cultures of the invading Indo-Europeans. So there is this story about a transition from a society where women had more power to one where they were increasingly oppressed. In my work, I try to question the material, literary, and psychological fantasies that underlie this quest for an original mother goddess. I think what I'm skeptical about is a literalist reading of myth, by which I mean a reading that sees powerful women in myth as necessarily implying female agency in the text. I am interested instead in a symptomatic reading of these texts and in trying to understand the fantasies that underlie these figures. Or in other words, in reading these texts as the dream work or the manifest content that needs to be deconstructed in order to lead us to the dream thought or the latent content. So one of my chapters, for instance, will be on J.J. Bachofen, this Swiss philologist and anthropologist who in 1861 published his monumental work Das Mutterrecht, in which he claimed that the earliest age of humanity was governed by a powerful matriarchy. So he worked with anthropological evidence, but also with Greek mythology to argue his claim. It's a fascinating study, that traced the eventual decline of maternal law, and how patriarchy ultimately triumphs, through a series of successive historical stages. So for Bachofen, this archaic transition is a necessary historical movement when the physicality of maternal law is overtaken by the spirituality of the father. I am no historian, and my interest is not so much in the historical veracity of these claims as in the inseparability of fact and fiction, in understanding how truth and fantasy may collide, coincide, and coexist. Does the fact that these ancient cultures worship the mother goddess necessarily imply that women were more free or had more power? Can we so linearly map religious fantasies onto social realities? Therefore, instead of working with archaeological or anthropological narratives so much, my research primarily examines the heterogeneous corpus of ancient Greek and Sanskrit literary and philosophical texts, along with their receptions, in order to analyze the fantasies, the transferences, and projections at work in these texts, and their ideological moorings. Given my theoretical interests, I will be investigating how these ancient cultures are grappling with the aporia, the paradox presented by the maternal figure. One might ask me why the mother in particular and not women or the feminine as such, or whether I'm using the two terms synonymously. I'm of course not conflating the feminine with the maternal, but I do think that given the symbolic and historical associations between the two, as well as the fact that motherhood has been perhaps the most privileged marker of sexual difference, it is in the figure of the mother that the ambivalences and anxieties regarding the feminine become much more amplified, much more manifest, in a way that an examination of the maternal leads us towards an analysis of the feminine as such. It's a Freudian argument in a way, the idea that the analysis of the hysteric helps us understand the human psyche in general. I'm also interested in queering motherhood, queering natality, and tapping these ancient foundational texts for resources that have either been ignored or been appropriated by often very conservative readings. I think this is especially important at a time when there is this rise of fascist forces across the world, and especially in India, where we have a perverse cocktail of an authoritarian regime and a myopic assertion of Hindu religious identity, where many of these ancient texts are often politically charged and are used to sanction religious and social discrimination. So I will end my presentation just by talking a little bit about the chapter that I just finished writing. So I mentioned at the beginning that I'm working with this Bengali collection of speculative conversations between ancient Greek and Hindu characters. It's by Shishir Kumar Das, a well-known Bengali cultural critic, comparativist. So his book, Alaukik Shonglap. So the dialogue that I focus on and on which my first chapter is grounded is called Dui Matrighati, or Two Matricides, which involves Orestes, who had killed his own mother. So he's trying to escape the Furies when he bumps into Parshuram, who has walked thousands of miles over many years from India to Greece. It's a fascinating dialogue where they talk about their respective pasts, their crime of killing their mothers on the behest of their father, as I said, because the mother had desired another man. I'm interested in asking, how does, if at all, such a conversation become possible? How do ancient Greek and Hindu thinking translate into each other? What happens when such thinking, already so distant from us, is translated into modern Bengali, and then again into English, in the way that I'm doing in my dissertation. And I'm also actually translating this book into English right now. So what is lost? What remains untranslatable? In this chapter, I analyze this modern Bengali dialogue, as well as ancient myths concerning Orestes and Parshuram in the context of matricide, ancient sexological literature, and modern debates around surrogacy and artificial insemination. What also interests me about this dialogue is that it starts with the word Bideshi, meaning foreigner, and ends with the word Bondhu, friend. So they have a long debate on matricide, and they do not agree on a lot of things. They often fail to translate their positions. And remember, it's an ancient Greek and an ancient Hindu character talking in modern Bengali. So the problem of translation is very much at work here. And yet they become friends. I will argue that in bringing the murdered maternal body to light through their conversation, they allow for the appearance of this other space where boundaries between the self and the other become porous and fragile. And by doing so, this dialogue gestures towards an ethics that is otherwise than paternal, and a logic of friendship that is grounded in difference and untranslatability. So my dissertation thus explores how the Greek classics interface with the study of Sanskrit texts, how a comparative study of antiquity and its receptions can radically reshape our perceptions, not only of gender and sex, but also of the shared legacies we inherit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is totally fascinating, and I have many questions, many more actually than I can even ask. I have many questions, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more. I mean, you touched on this. What is it that comparative work does for you that that say the close reading, right, the intense reading of a single work within a single context doesn't seem to accomplish?
So I'm of course doing close readings of these texts as well, but I think what comparative work allows me to do is to play different cultures, both with and against each other, in a way that interrogates some of the fundamental, often invisible assumptions of each of the disciplines. So while in India, the Hindu literary and philosophical corpus is often seen as a totalizing system, in the West, it's the Greek texts, which are foundational to what we call Western civilization. So my dissertation kind of reopens the maternal figure in these two cultures in a way that they can speak to, push against, perhaps even displace each other, and the centrality that they have, and the repressions and the hegemonies that they are deemed to have instituted. As much as they in turn also destabilize and displace our own interpretive and theoretical positions. So I think, again, it's also a process that confronts us with the problem of the untranslatable. How do we translate the other, the other culture in this context without reducing it to the logic of the same? How to keep difference alive, but translate nevertheless. So I think comparative work is, in this sense, also an ethical work. And yeah, I think it helps me do much more than looking simply at one tradition would have allowed.
Well, and your work is, right, it is comparative, but it also is in many ways triangulation also doesn't seem to quite have enough, maybe a whole network is really the more appropriate, sort of model for thinking, right? Because you're dealing also with the modern as a way into the ancient, not, including your, sort of theoretical, frameworks, but also in terms of using Shishir Kumar Das's work, right? So how have you thought about how to incorporate, right, this modern sort of imagination of the ancient without imposing in another way, right? Imposing the modern back onto the ancient world.
Right, I think this is a very important question. I think this is where close reading really helps. Philology and knowledge of the languages help. Knowledge of the history of the particular socio-political context helps. I would like to believe that, my training in ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, and also some French, plus I think my background in literature and like feminist theory and so on, makes me in a way uniquely positioned to do this kind of a project. But this is also related to what I said in response to your previous question. On the one hand, you need to be imaginative enough to bring these fields together, see their intersections, and read them in interesting and imaginative ways. But on the other hand, you have to be rigorous. You have to be careful that you're not appropriating this text or imposing very neat modern categories on them. In fact, that's one of the tasks of my dissertation, to problematize modern ideas of gender and sex, or modern kind of universalizing tendencies of some of the disciplines, such as psychoanalysis. So for instance, if I'm using psychoanalysis, I'm not simply mapping psychoanalytic concepts onto these texts, but investigating how psychoanalytic itself is complicated by this encounter. Or when I'm using feminist theory, it's not so much about using modern Western theory to read an ancient non-Western object, as much about the fact that these theories offer me a set of questions, or I would say a set of questions that allow me to foreground certain problems that are already there in the text. So in this context, if I may, I can talk a little bit about my chapter, which is called Freud Travels to Calcutta. This will probably be my final chapter, where I examine how Freud's ideas were received in Bengal, starting with Girindra Shekhar Bose, who was the first non-Western psychoanalyst, and he set up the Indian Psychoanalytic Association, Indian Psychoanalytic Society, I think, in 1921. He and Freud had long epistolary correspondences. There was no email or Twitter then, but where Bose pushed against some of Freud's ideas, and they had these long disagreements about the role of the mother in psychoanalytic development. And while Freud was deeply influenced by Greek myth, we all know about the Oedipus complex, Bose was inspired by the important role that mother goddesses, he thought, played in the Indian psyche. But even in the chapters where I'm analyzing ancient texts per se, which will be the first three chapters, I think, I'm very careful that I do not do a kind of neat one-on-one analysis of texts, but really kind of see how, as I said, they're playing with each other.
And this must also be the case of your use of the German English socialist tradition. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned that, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So this will come up in my chapter on Bachofen's theory of an ancient matriarchy. So interestingly, Bachofen's theory, the theory of the idea that there was an ancient matriarchy which was eventually replaced by a paternal law, this theory had a huge influence on 19th century socialists. So Friedrich Engels, for instance, in his famous book, The Origin of the Family, private property and the origin of the family, private property and the state, he draws heavily on Bachofen's ideas to argue that there was this matrilineal, matriarchal culture in the Neolithic age. And by doing so, Engels argues that this shows how patriarchy and the patrilineal family are products of material historical processes that consolidated once private property came to dominate social relations. On the other hand, the other English utopian socialist and early gay rights activist, Edward Carpenter, was also hugely influenced by Bachofen, but he read him differently than Engels. Carpenter was also hugely influenced by Hinduism, actually, and especially by the Bhagavad Gita, and he was a close friend of Mahatma Gandhi. And for for Carpenter, Bachofen's ideas could lead to the eventual theorization of a queer family, of a different framework for theorizing the family. So I'm interested in how, while Engels was drawing on Bachofen to understand the heterosexual family, Carpenter was drawing on the same writer in a way to provide us with an alternative queer framework to understand the family.
That sort of points, I think, to a zoom out, although you're dealing with such large issues in such sort of fascinating ways. But I'm wondering what you see as, or if you could describe what you see as the stakes of this project.
I think it can revitalize comparative studies because we don't really see much comparative work being done in ancient Greek and ancient Hindu literatures, especially in the context of feminist philosophy, queer theory, gender and sexuality studies. I think I want to talk about how this can be significant to feminist and queer studies. So one of the other axes I'm interested in is the relationship of the maternal with queerness and with natality. So as you probably know, there has been an antenatal turn in queer theory recently, a turn towards negativity, which was very important because it destigmatized the negativity that labels queer subjects as perverse. In doing so, queer theory presented us with a powerful critique of the rhetoric of assimilation, that is advanced in queer organizations, for instance, the Pride and marriage equality, and also their uneasy nexus with the neoliberal market, which seems to be very pro-LGBTQ and so on. Lee Edelman, for instance, has argued that the only way you can be queer is by embracing the radical negativity of the death drive and by refusing to participate in the logic of reproductive futurism. So he asks queers to do away with the celebration of life that is represented by the figure of the child. Now, while these are excellent and very necessary critiques of the complicity between capitalism and the imperative to reproduce, I believe that this insistence on radical negativity as the sole model for political engagement neglects the tensions and ambivalences that birth itself, life itself, is riven with. So while theorists like Lee Edelman see queerness as the non-generative repetition of the death drive, I'm trying to theorize a queerness that has place both for the mother and the child without falling into the trap of reproductive futurism or compulsory heterosexuality. a queerness that does not exclude life and the opaque, messy processes of coming to be, of the production and proliferation of bodies and desires beyond conscious or predictable pathways. And I think that going back to these ancient texts, because these ancient texts have been so foundational, or let me put it this way, because we can see the earliest ideological grounding of the family in these ancient texts. I think going back to them allows me to interrogate and problematize these foundational moments and interpret them in other ways, in ways that can kind of reshape the way we look at our histories, traditions, genealogies. And I think these questions require serious rethinking today when issues such as abortion and parenting rights are fiercely debated. Assisted reproductive technologies like artificial insemination, IVF, surrogacy, remain points of contention in several countries, and queer kinships and same-sex parenting are increasingly gaining ground. And some of my chapters deal with this. In fact, the chapter that I mentioned, about Parashurama and Orestes meeting, and because in that chapter, the birth of Parashurama it's a really convoluted, messy thing. Parashurama was supposed to be born in the previous generation, but then his birth was kind of transferred to the next generation, and so in a way he has both mothers, where there was this kind of transfer of the womb taking place in a way. So these are interesting things, and I want to ask how they kind of can help us look at ancient texts in non-normative ways.
It's really incredible, this the sort of I don't know, historical spectrum in which you're positioning and thinking about these things. So I have one final question, and it's a small one comparatively, right? So, but the stakes are high here. You're deeply involved in the Saving Ancient Studies Alliance. Could you just tell us quickly about that?
Yeah, I think so. Save Ancient Studies Alliance is a forum that I think really came alive sometime in 2019, early 2020, and most of the organizers and participants are either graduate students or people who had just finished graduation, basically people who are really interested in ancient studies. And they realized that there has been a downward trend in ancient studies in the US and I think across the world, especially with funding being slashed for ancient studies departments. And this is really a project to revitalize ancient studies and kind of spread interest. And they organize a lot of conferences and reading groups. And anyone listening this can kind of join as a participant or just help us out. And so I actually led 2 reading groups last year, one in the summer and one in the winter, and had a lot of fun, really. One was in the summer, I led a reading, like a longer reading group for the entire summer on ancient Greek and Sanskrit texts. But then in the winter, it was a shorter reading group for just 3 weeks, and we read Euripides' Bacchae together. And I think anyone interested in ancient studies or just curious about it should, just come and join the reading group. They're fascinating. It's very informal and a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Tuhin. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is entirely mine, honestly.